Welcome back to BetterHelp's In-Session series. I'm Hesujo, a licensed therapist and part of the clinical operations team here at BetterHelp. Today, we're super excited to be joined by fellow BetterHelp therapist Kathy Gomatos, and we will be talking about mental health in Latin communities. Kathy Gomatos is a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Florida and New Jersey. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in social work from the University of Central Florida, is an EMDR trained therapist, and a certified clinical trauma professional. Kathy is an expert in working with individuals to regain control of their life by helping them work through anxiety, depression, trauma, and life adjustments to ultimately find the peace and joy everyone deserves. Kathy, thank you so much for taking the time to be on our In-Session series today. To start us off, I'd really like to get to know a little bit more about you, your therapeutic background, and why you decided to become a therapist.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me. So, why did I start this journey as a therapist? Well, if I look back at it, I think I was always very interested in human behavior. I do recall from very early on being able to understand or questioning and understanding, like, why do certain people behave a certain way? Like, does that have to do with the brain? I mean, as a child, I was thinking these things. So human behavior and just how we all operate was something that I was already interested in. So I think that really opened up as I, started to go to school and wondering, what was going to be my career choice. That I found this career and I love it. I really do. I love it. I don't see it as a job. I think I just see it as a privilege.
That's really wonderful. And I'm glad that you decided to take this track because, part of the conversation today is really diving into some information about how mental health treatment or struggles with mental health may manifest. And of course, I understand you can't speak for the entire Latin community, but I imagine you have some firsthand experience and knowledge of, recognizing the diversity in this large group of people globally, and that maybe there are some barriers even to access to care and like cultural considerations. So I was wondering if we could start there, just like some of your thoughts on experiencing mental health stuff, even your exposure level to what therapy is as a child, anything really.
Yeah, I mean, so much. I tell you, so much. Well, once again, yes, we're talking about general, right? I mean, it's not a cookie cutter for the Latin community, and there's some exceptions. However, we know that if we look at the Latin community, generally speaking, we know that one of our biggest barriers in certain, especially areas within the country, is lack of insurance access, lack of access to care. So that is where folks unfortunately just don't have the health insurance coverage to be able to access support for their mental health needs. And then that leaves them with self-pay options. And unfortunately, they also can't financially afford that. So, access to care is important. It's actually one of the reasons and the barriers to why we may not be able to see a lot of our Latin community be able to seek and get the support that they need. In addition to that, we also have, as a community, we have a huge stigma among mental health. And even though stigma with mental health does show in other areas and other communities and culture, it is particularly true in the Latin community. We definitely do not talk about mental health. We don't acknowledge mental health, and we don't recognize mental health, right? Clinically speaking, as a therapist, many times I find myself having to identify symptoms and signs to my clients that really do conclude, hey, that's anxiety. Hey, that's depression. Hey, that actually is a sign or a symptom or a trigger from trauma. And they're like, what? My mom has that. My uncle has that. Like, so many people in my family have that, but no one has acknowledged, or even no one says, I have anxiety or I have depression. That's a one of the biggest component. We just don't talk about it within our own community.
Yeah, I can imagine it being very difficult to kind of navigate how you're supposed to address some of these challenges you're experiencing when you don't have the language. So I'm hearing that a lot of your work with Spanish speaking clientele is education, psychoeducation on what they might be experiencing. I'm sure in therapy and in mental health in general, like folks in this industry, this field, we love to put words onto human experience that everybody's already quite familiar with. So I'm wondering just your perspective, where do you think this I don't think unwillingness is the right word all the time because I'm sure some people do want to talk about it, but you're saying that people just don't talk about this. I imagine we could talk for a really long time about why you think that is, but just high level, why do you think this particular community or many communities in general are not talking about mental health?
I'll start off by saying that I love my community. Being Hispanic, being from the Latin community, I see it as a privilege. I see it like I have grown and evolved personally and professionally to embrace my roots. So I'll start off saying that. However, with that, I also want to acknowledge that we have a lot of growth to do. And in the mental health area. And to answer your question is that, we are so strong as a culture that then it opens up the vulnerability that when we're struggling, so whether it's that anxiety, whether it's that severe stress, whether it's that we've experienced something traumatic, whether it's depression, it's so hard for us to recognize that now we're not at our strongest and that now we need to reach out for support or we need help. Because what is one of the important lessons we very early on in the Latin community learn is that we're strong and we help others. We're strong and we, fight for others. We're strong and we, as a family, we get through it. That's something that you always know. And then if anything changes within your life, that all of a sudden you're not that strong identity that is part of like your values, then you don't even know what to do with that. And that means that something wrong with me. Did I do something wrong? Am I missing something now that I am experiencing this and I have to find someone that can help me? So this is maybe one of the reasons why many times it's hard to take that step in our community, because we are very strong. And so that can be a strength, but in some situations that can also be our weakness. I definitely see that within our community to be a challenge.
It makes a lot of sense to, highly value a certain characteristic. I mean, if we do this to any kind of characteristic and say that this is the most important thing, there's going to be like some side effects or some fallout from that. And it sounds like in your personal experience, you've experienced this too, right? It's like somewhere along the way, we've decided as people that vulnerability and strength are different. But I think a lot of our work as therapists is trying to integrate those things and having our clients see it takes a lot of strength to be vulnerable. It's just a different kind of muscle that we don't get a lot of chances to work out. And, as you're speaking, I think back to some of the stats that we've been researching and looking into. And, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is a great resource for folks that are unsure of where to start looking into mental health and what does anxiety mean? What is depression? What can I do if I'm experiencing this stuff? But they're reporting that more than half of young adults in the Latin community, ages 18 to 25, with serious mental illness may not be receiving treatment. So I think this definitely speaks to everything that you're talking about here. And another large percentage of young people in this community receive treatment at a much lower rate than their white American counterparts in the US at the very least. So we talked about some of these things, but I wonder if do you have any other insight or perspective to share about further origins of mental health challenges? Even this other piece topic that is very pervasive in, I think, every single community is generational trauma. Now, the flavor of that generational trauma is going to look very different when you look at different groups based on their history, right? There's like history of war and religion and differing cultural values. Like these kinds of things can be observed in history across every country. But I'm wondering if you can share some specifics to your experience, your family history, your heritage.
Well, if we look at some of the origins, like if we look at here in the United States, and we see what has happened and how have we evolved the Latin community in the last years, we can see a great amount of the first generational adults now that their parents, our parents, migrated from, our countries and came to the US for a better future, right? So that's one of the components. And that transition alone is significant, because then you have parents who left their country with their children to come to the United States for a better future, just for a better life, fleeing either wars, politics, poverty, trauma, so many things. And so they're already coming to be able to give the children or in themselves a better future. Now, this first generation, right, that is here or even are born here, now have this struggle, and I've seen this within my own clinical practice, that now I am a Latin Spanish person in this country, but I look differently. My family dynamic is different. We think somewhat differently. We approach things differently, but I am American. How does that make sense? What does that mean? I mean, there's just so much internal confusion, right? And not only that, but then there's some levels of, then you're also perceived differently, especially in certain parts of the country, right? Because yeah, some people do stand out. So there's that evolution of and being able to discover of, how can I be able to embrace my culture, my parents' culture, and also embrace that I'm also an American and I'm a citizen. And how do those two cultures, how can I blend those two cultures together? That takes a lot of work. A lot of my clients, all we focus on is working on that. This idea that it has to be defined or it's a cookie cutter, but it's not. It's so complex and it's very different for so many people. So that's one. The other part is what happens in that family dynamic. You have that child that is either brought from another country or even is born here from migrating parents. And then that child has a level of responsibility that some children won't. They have to translate for their parents. They have to guide their parents. They have to teach their parents, where a child is supposed to be receiving help with their homework. Now this child is actually teaching their parents how to read a bill, how, go with them to the doctor's appointment to translate what. So now you have this child, or at this point, adolescent, adult, because it continues that responsibility that I'm constantly the family translator, support system, navigator, and that's a lot for a person to carry. That's a lot of responsibility, especially if it starts very early on, has childhood. And, and it's very complicated, because then when we talk about boundaries, many times as clinicians, we're able to be like, yep, clear boundaries, good, we can do this, we can do that. But that is a very complex boundary to establish, because your parents at the end of the day need you. And you still, many times you'll find that you still feel that sense of responsibility for your parents, because they made that sacrifice. You have a better future, you have a better life. It's very complex as a clinician helping someone navigate those waters, for sure.
Complex is a good word to use here. Like, some of the things that you shared are even relatable, I'm sure, for any adult person out there that was raised by immigrants. Like you said, it's, on one hand, can be easy for us to compartmentalize and see where the boundaries are supposed to be. You are a parent, you're supposed to do this. You are a child, your parent's supposed to do this. But when you have the kid that now becomes responsible for certain things or expected to be available for certain things, now this child is being, like, what therapists like to call, like, parentified, right? And those boundaries get blurry. It's unclear. Like, the mom is feeling, I'm supposed to technically be the boss, but for the kid to say, you can't even pay your bills or understand the medical history without me there, so why am I supposed to listen to you? So I could see these things turning into complicated or challenging family dynamics, for sure. I've also worked with clients that are in high school, for example, and they have this ability to skirt around all kinds of stuff because their parents just don't understand. All this to say, I'm hearing then another significant barrier, largely for young people to enter any kind of mental health services. Their parents probably don't even know it exists. Their parents may not know how to navigate healthcare that's been provided to them by the school or even their local county, and a lot of differences in terms of life experience. You mentioned the parents have made this large sacrifice getting over here, and people all have different stories of how they arrived in this country. But for a lot of folks, it's very traumatizing, whatever that journey was. And so I'm sure a lot of people then feel guilty. There's a lot of guilty feelings to, continue fulfilling this role for their parents. Can you tell me how you think maybe that guilt or whatever it is, that obligation that we might feel to parents, like how does that all kind of tie into maybe some people still not seeking out therapy even if they have it in front of them?
Yeah, and once again, it's complex, right? Because we don't know the pieces to specific dynamics and circumstances. But to work through that guilt is the first thing is, and it's one of those things that does not only apply for Latin communities seeking mental health, but even anyone when it comes to the relationship with their parents. Um, it's not that you're seeking therapy because your parents are bad or they did something wrong. I always like to clarify that for people because yes, you come to therapy and you're like, I experienced this or this and that because of my parents, but and then they feel bad. They're like, but my parents are wonderful. And I give them the space and the understanding to know, I know they're wonderful. Parents most times have the best intentions. They truly do. But it's just unfortunate that sometimes, based on those best intentions, the way that we perceive things or how the person experiences things does not go with their intentions. And that's where, obviously, as clinicians, we're helping them understand but heal through that. So yes, of course, two things can be right where your parents wanted the best for you, but in that transition, they also caused some challenges. And there's been some adjustments, or there's been just some difficulties that now you have to be able to work through. So that's the best way I can help someone start to understand and work through that guilt when it comes to a situation like this, for sure.
Yeah, it's like you said, complicated and not something easily solved in a quick conversation. I'm beginning to understand even that for many of your clients, there's probably some first things that need to be addressed or worked through, resolved before somebody can start getting into their very personal goals. What I'm hearing is like there may be specific mental health stigma that exists within Latin communities. And I think we see this stigma kind of manifest in its own ways in all kinds of different communities. Even here in the States, there's still stigma attached to seeking out therapy. But I was wondering if you can share a bit more of your expertise and insight on how this kind of stigma might manifest in your specific community or in the Latin community at large.
The first thing is the stigma related to depression, anxiety. I like to say, interesting enough, in the Latin community, we have used or heard how they say, I'm having ataque de nervios, which means like a nervous attack or panic attack, anxiety attack. Like that term is used very loosely, but not necessarily in a clinical way. It's um, just like, oh, ataque de nervio. But yeah, we don't acknowledge what really is a anxiety attack and what it is to feel like you are just not able to control, your feelings, your emotions, your thoughts, and so forth. Many times also the stigma comes around the other verbiage of oh, you must be crazy, tú eres loco. If you're going to therapy or if you have anxiety, tú eres loca, you must be loca, you must be crazy. And that, sometimes it's just that the language that also sometimes intentionally or unintentionally, I would say, puts that stigma too. If I go to therapy or if I have anxiety, does that make me crazy? And that itself is very challenging. The other part of the stigma may also be that there's even a language barrier within just own family. Like if your parent is not fluent in English and you want to help them understand what you're having difficulty with, or it doesn't have to be a parent and child, it can certainly be from siblings and so forth, then how do you explain to them what anxiety is? How do you explain to them what depression is? How do you explain to them like the effects of trauma in Spanish? Because yeah, I know it in English, but I don't know how to say that in Spanish. And so part of what I discussed earlier, right, is that many times you find that in the Latin community we have to educate But now how do I educate when there's a language barrier? And that itself too may also be part of that stigma, that even as you're trying to explain, it's not making sense and they're just not still grasping it. So there's a lot of different elements that just make it very difficult. And it's a driving force.
It's interesting because you shared that there's certain phrases in Spanish that clue us in that these cultures very much are in tune with things like anxiety or panic attacks, stress that's to a certain extent that it causes issue in your life. Like this is known, but what's not as familiar, I guess, in a lot of English speaking, non-Western influenced places is the idea of sitting in front of a stranger and like talking about that stuff. Even when you're sharing, like, I'm fluent in English now, so I'm able to express myself to a certain degree, but I can't say those things in Spanish. That's like a sign that like my parents didn't talk about this stuff, so I don't have the language for that because it just wasn't part of, our family culture to use these words. And that's why I don't know the words to bring it up. Chances are our parents actually know those words. It's just they didn't say it in front of us, so we don't really know. And then, language is so interesting because it certainly does dictate, if not heavily influence, the way that we think. We're limited to think in the language that we know. So if our parents are not using their own language to think about like, CBT and how it can be used to treat anxious symptoms, like if they're not thinking about that stuff to begin with, how do you start that conversation? So I can see that being very, very challenging. And then, I think you touched on how in a lot of families in this community, there's a value in being strong, right? Like there's even like things I've read, like pressure to be tough. I think a lot of people that are, interested in learning Spanish, they're going to learn about machismo and what that means and what that looks like. And so was hoping that you could help educate listeners that may not be familiar with concepts like this that exist in a community's culture and how that ties into America's view or the Western view of mental health. For me as an outsider, I see machismo as something that brings a lot of strength to a community, but as you begin to try to dissect it and understand it and what it means from a Western point of view, it gets complicated. So I was hoping that you could help educate
And
me.
in an extreme, right? There's a sense
Mhm.
of being strong, but machismo is like only men can be strong and women. So it takes an extreme perspective. However, you bring up a good point, and it's the sense that within our community, like I mentioned, right, we are built with a sense of we are strong, we can do it, and we will do it. However, what we lack is also when you talked about the language, right? How that our parents or within our own dynamics, we don't hear the language, the vulnerability language. One of the things I find within my clients or within the culture is that we lack, once again, just not everyone, but within our culture, we can see that there's a lack of emotional connection, right? Like tough love is tough love in the Latin community. Like I am going to teach you a lesson, and many times that parents obviously are there to teach us lesson, navigate life, but the way that is taught is in a very harsh way. Is going to be name calling, shaming, sometimes somewhat of like reverse psychology, guilt tripping. And I'll give you an example. Something I've become very familiar with hearing is that we install that sense of fear and anxiety from very early on. You're mistreating or you're not appreciating me as a mother, for example. You're not appreciating me. One day you'll miss me when I'm gone or when I'm dead. Now, mind you, this is something that we may hear other communities say or do and so forth, but it's definitely something that happens within our Latin community. And then you're installing that sense of fear-based, right? Manipulation of like, I want to be able to connect with you, but I'm doing it in a very somewhat unhealthy, dysfunctional way. And then, we do those things. And for example, another example would be instead of the lesson of like wellness and nutrition and, you know, nourishing your body, is the name calling, you know, being able to say you look very fat today, or you look like you've gained weight. Spanish folks and, you know, Latin community folks can certainly attest that when there's a holiday or birthday or a gathering coming, and you're not in your best image or in your best place in your life, you're going to feel some type of way, because you know there's going to be that aunt, that uncle, someone who's going to point out your weight, who's going to point out your look, is going to point out that you're not married yet, that you don't have children, maybe you haven't finished college, that you don't have money. Someone's going to point out. And once again, is yes, there's a lesson that they're probably just trying to like, hey, so, you know, maybe they're trying to give you motivation or trying just to update, you see where you've been up to, but the approach is very harsh. It's that tough love. And so when we have that as a community, where we have that, where those very sensitive, difficult topics are in a very harsh way, it's just very uneasy. Like, then I don't like to connect with you. I don't like to give you updates about my intimate stuff. I don't like, now I build a wall, because I know that my vulnerability, my weakness is used against me. So what does that look like then if I have anxiety, or if I'm struggling with depression, or if I have experienced a trauma? Would I ever have the courage to even share that? Because can that and will that be used against me? And that's deep, because then that's where you'll notice that, once again, yes, we're talking about like we're strong, but then there's the other side of it. It's the other side of, then if there's any weakness, if there's anything that, I mean, humans, we all have just areas of our life we're not at our best capacity, but if we're not there yet, that can also be used against you and really like shamed in a public way, in a family dynamic setting, for sure.
Yeah, that sounds very, very difficult for people to overcome. Like this thing that you're talking about of parents may have a certain way of communicating something to get someone to do something differently. In the example that you gave, like, I'm going to shame you into changing your diet or changing your lifestyle rather than a different way. And this, I think, goes back to the generational piece. I imagine they're doing that because that's how their parents brought them
Correct.
up. And to them, it's like normal. This is how my mom expressed her love and care for me, is to be like a bit critical and a bit harsh about these things, because that's how I know she cares. She wouldn't say any of this stuff if she just didn't care. And then, of course, like, put on top of that, raising your kids in this country where they're now comparing their family experience to something that might be very different, that can make it even more challenging. And I hate to reduce a whole community's family experience into like a Disney movie, but speaking of Disney movies, there is that movie Encanto, which I'm thinking of, because a lot of the dynamics that you're talking about, I think, were highlighted in that film. I'll try not to spoil it for folks that haven't seen the movie, but there's a matriarch and there's a family, like a huge family, where there's a lot of pressure for something to be something. There's pressure around identity and what you can do to fulfill your family's expectations. So I don't know if you've seen that movie, if there's other connections you can draw, but for folks out there that are really curious, this is like a place to start, right? Like, some people are very unsure of where to start researching cultural differences. And so I do like that there are films out there, there's media out there to give us some clues and hints. And of course, we watch it understanding this is not going to be a description of every single family out there. But, you know, this pressure that exists that you're talking about, maybe retreating into yourself when you find being authentic is met with something that you're not looking for or expecting. So yeah, I don't know if there's like anything else in that space that you want to share more thoughts on.
I mean, Encanto is by far one of my favorite movies. Not only because it's from Colombia, although the family is Colombian and I'm Colombian myself, but the message that Encanto sends out to the Latin community, but to anyone, you are able to identify with the character. That movie was done so beautifully. And as a therapist, I can watch that movie over and over and over again, and just every single time truly value the message, the meaning behind everything. So let's start off right with Abuela. The Abuela is pretty much the one that's running the show. And how did that start? Well, she unfortunately had to flee where they used to live. And in part of fleeing, she actually saw her husband get murder, trauma. And then you flee. And then now it's that, right? That migration just has happened. And so now she had the responsibility, or feels that responsibility, to make a better living and make everything work. So abuela stands for a lot of what our parents, or just anyone who's made sacrifices, feel and believe. And then you have Maribel, which doesn't have a gift. All the family has a gift except her, and I think she does a beautiful job at being able to identify and show what I was describing of that first generation child, that the parents move over, and then now you're in like these two cultures. Everyone has a gift, and then what is my gift? I'm confused. How do I identify? But I have a responsibility that I have to heal, that I have to solve, and that's all she does in the movie. And then you have the other characters, her siblings, which is Isabella's the perfect one, pretty one, but then has, that's what she appears. And then as you get to know her character more, you notice that there's a lot of insecurities, and then she's just not happy with what she's expected to be, which so many people can identify with. Then is, the other sister, which is Luisa, and she's like she has the strength. She has to help the family with her strength. If you actually listen to the song that's about Luisa, she talks about, I'm worthless if my strength is not being used. And that's her identity. Once again, she feels that she has so much stress that she may actually crack. Luisa is a perfect example of high functioning anxiety. In the surface level, she's making things, work, and she's so strong, and she's helping. But as you get to know her character more, you realize, wow, this is really tough. And inside, she's struggling significantly. And then you got Bruno, who, we don't talk about Bruno, which is one of the most popular songs, right? And what does that mean? That means that there's family secrets, that there's taboo topics we don't talk about, him, mental health, that there's an uncle that maybe does suffer from depression, anxiety, or something, but yeah, we like don't talk about him, or something like that, So it does a beautiful job at being able to show that any family dynamic, but definitely in the Latin community, there's challenges, and they're real, they're valid. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad family or a bad person. It just means that this is the uniqueness of who we are. And if we can just align that with the support and services that are out there, it can work. When that village comes together and rebuilds their house, that's like a therapist coming together with all the support in the community and saying, like, yeah, you guys are strong, but you can be stronger together over this additional tools, So I love that movie.
You made me love it even more. Like, you're speaking, I thought of the great soundtrack, and it really sounds like they were able to stick into so many of these different characters, a dynamic that can be very much observed in Latin families, a lot of families. But family culture, I think, is like pretty well illustrated by this. It's not uncommon to have a matriarch in the family that, of course, has probably experienced quite a lot of trauma herself, and trying to bring up a new generation to the best of her ability, which can look like, this is what I know to be successful. So in order for you to be successful, I'm going to make sure that you live this life that I think is the way. So in a lot of ways in that movie, I love it too. It helped me see that, like, folks watching this can begin to have a heart for their parents, because, you and I talked about feeling guilty to do certain things for them. And for some people, that can turn into resentment later on in life. You made me do this, you made me do that, so why should I be any kind of good child to you? But it helps us see, there's like an illustration here that, like, everybody's a product of their own traumas, and they're just trying their best most of the time.
Yeah.
And then it helps us reconcile all these different feelings that we have. Even Mirabel, like she has her own journey and she has to come to a place where she can acknowledge that her grandma too has gone through a lot of stuff. It's not just about her own stuff. Um, so it sounds like we could talk about this movie all day.
Love that movie.
Um, but I do think it's like a good way to um, like wrap up a lot of the things that we discussed in this wonderful conversation about how there's, a lot of love to be experienced in various family structures. But sometimes when you love so much and you love too hard, you have blinders on about what real loving, open acceptance looks like for people that may want to live a different life than what we had envisioned for them. Um, and I love how you wrapped it up in terms of the end where we find some kind of reconciliation or some kind of healing is similar to what a therapist can do when a family is open to seeing each other differently, understanding where the other person is coming from. So I really appreciate you making those connections to that movie because I think it's a very easy way to get people to see how something is illustrated. So I'm wondering if there's any other key takeaways or things that you want to make sure to include in this particular conversation.
Yeah. Well, and so one more note, because, before the takeaways, that piece too, it goes into the stigma component, right? So many times, once again, we think as a culture, but as a society, many of these misconceptions about what a therapist role is and what
Mhm.
therapy is all about. And one of the misconceptions we often hear is, why would a stranger tell me what to do? Or why would I, why? Like, I can solve my problems by myself. And that is so far away from the truth of what we do as therapists. We are not going to tell you what to do.
Mhm.
We are going to use your inner strength and your own knowledge to help you build from where you are to where you want to be. And that's where I tell my clients, I don't know more than you. You tell me and I help you make sense of it. And so that's important to understand, because many times that's even a barrier and a stigma that really, unfortunately, hinders that next step of help and support. So yeah, wanted to kind of add that before the takeaways. Um, Takeaways, I would say that, speaking to the Latin community, understanding that, you know, you definitely deserve to be heard. Your story is valid. Two things can be right at the same time, like good intentions but yet challenges that came from that. Your uniqueness is important. Like, we are just a community that there's so much that we experience and that we um have to deal with, that it's important for folks to understand that that takes a lot of work to be able to figure out, and sometimes it's too much within our own minds. We really have to be able to sometimes give that piece to someone else to make sense of it, or help us make sense of it, and then give it back, because we already are carrying a lot of responsibility. But then that leaves me with the importance of making sure you have a good therapeutic alliance, a therapeutic connection with someone that understands your culture, understands your language, understands, just the Latin community, and respects it too. Do you know that there's only 6.3% of Latin therapists in this country? I mean,
I didn't. That's very small, especially like in certain parts of the country, that is not representative of the population breakdown, demographics, all that stuff. So
yeah.
pretty shocking.
So that means that, right, if I am finally got to that point that I want to be able to get support and reach out to someone and work through my own mental health and my challenges, now I have to find someone who I identify with. And not that you always have to identify, not that you always have to find someone who is from your same culture, but some people want that or need that. And that's okay. And then if that's your choice and if that's your preference, then you only have a 6.3%. And that itself can be a barrier and can also be discouraging, you know? So my takeaways is just to make sure that you find someone that you feel connected to, feel respected to, that's willing to give you that space. You know, being able to truly embrace the uniqueness of your culture, of your heritage, and just, you know, polish yourself, because we are all beautiful. We are all worthy of happiness, joy. And it's just a matter of being able to understand what our strength is, how to empower ourselves. And that's pretty much my takeaway. You know, I anyone watching this, I hope that they are able to connect with what I'm saying, with what I'm able to share within my own personal experience, clinical experience, and that if it resonates with them, that it encourages them to actually seek support, seek help, because they don't have to do this by themselves. And they shouldn't, you know. Therapists are here to support you, to hold your hands, to be that model, that positive model of being able to install those qualities that maybe some people just didn't get an opportunity to have. And so here, that's what we're here for.
Thank you so much. I can certainly feel the care and the passion and your encouragement to folks to seek out any kind of support that makes sense for them. And another takeaway I heard even is like an encouragement for folks in the community to consider becoming therapists. There's like a giant need. So
Yeah.
it's something for sure for people to consider. So thank you so much, Kathy, for your time, for sharing so much of these wonderful nuggets for our viewers and listeners. And we will link down below to anywhere that we can find you. And thank you so much.
Thank you.